Hello, my pretties. We are going to go over the first part of scene one of Act 5. So, most of the graveyard scene, but really just the involving the grave diggers. Okay. When you Google Hamlet, these are the pictures that come up. Almost all of them are Hamlet with the skull. And you have to wait until Act 5 to actually see Hamlet with the skull. But this is the most evocative image from the entire play. We're going to kind of explore why. So first of all, this scene starts out with, as a matter of fact, in the text, when you look at the character list, these two gravediggers are not called gravediggers, they are called clowns, because this is a comic relief scene. And comic relief serves a few different purposes. One is that it does provide some temporary levity between scenes that are usually very intense, very gruesome, or very tragic. We just had in Act 4, we just found out that Ophelia is dead, and we watched Claudius and Laertes plot to kill Hamlet, in covering all the bases that they think they need to cover, by the way. Two different forms of poison and a sharpened fencing blade. So they really want him dead. And then the next scene is going to be how all of that plays out, and we're going to have a lot of death in the next scene. And so this in-betweener gives us some jokes and just a little bit of levity. But the jokes are not just random jokes. They mirror and comment on themes and motifs in the play. And the clowns are fun when they come into a play because they can openly criticize the hero or any other person in power in sort of a protected way, because nobody on stage, at least, is taking them seriously. But we, the audience, can. So that's kind of interesting to note. So the gravediggers in this scene, just the two gravediggers, when they're talking, they comment on how rich and powerful people can get away with thwarting the law. The first gravedigger is going, but I don't understand. How is she being buried in a churchyard if she killed herself? And the other one, the second gravedigger, says, well, isn't that the way of things? I mean, if she wasn't a gentlewoman, then she wouldn't be here. To which the first gravedigger says something along the lines of, yeah, it's terrible that rich and powerful people can drown or hang themselves easier than their other Christian brothers, right? Yeah, rich people get away with more stuff than poor people do, and that's always been the case. The first gravedigger talks about how humble professions are more honorable than any other. He talks about the church's law being above all else, which is interesting because that's kind of a note that has played through the entire play, that there is a higher moral law that supersedes the law of man. And several characters have commented on it. And they've commented on how people like to appear good and moral, even if they aren't. But really, the ultimate point in that particular vein is that, heaven does see everything. And there is such a thing as moral justice, which is reassuring. All right, so Hamlet talks about a few different skulls in this scene. So as the gravedigger is digging his grave, he's throwing these skulls out of the ground. And Hamlet kind of muses over them. And the first skull that kind of falls at Hamlet's feet that he talks about, he says, oh, this could have been the pate of a politician or a courtier. And then the next one comes out of the grave and he says, ooh, this would have been the skull of a lawyer, maybe. And he comments on how these people aren't around anymore, and the politician, where's his political platform, or if it's a courtier, then, where's all his flattery gone? And with a lawyer, he says, how can he tolerate this guy, treating him so abysmally and not inform him of his act of battery. So he's sort of talking about what these people did in life and what they're reduced to now. The last skull that comes into this scene is the skull of Yorick, who is the king's jester who died more than 20 years ago. I think it's really, really cool and interesting, though, that when you think about this, you've got the two clowns speaking truth about power and about morality and stuff like that, and about honor. And that's the point. That's why they exist in a drama. And then we've got this jester who, like, that was his job, to speak truth to power in a funny way. So you really actually have three clowns on stage, and Hamlet just talked about two professions that are power professions, politicians, courtiers, they work in flattery and empty words. And then you have a lawyer who works to shuffle man's law around, to gain land or, defend people who are actually guilty and stuff like that. And then you have the jester. And the jester is the one that kind of brings to light all of the corruption and all of the emptiness and stuff. And I think that's a really cool move, that you have these two power figures and then you have a clown again. And so it's a kind of a form of mirroring, I think, on Shakespeare's part, and it's lovely. Now, Yorick himself, as Hamlet's talking about him, works as a symbol. And I think that's probably why so many images of Hamlet, when you just on a casual Google search, have him holding this skull. Because I think it's one of the most powerful motifs. I think it's where the motif and the symbol and the theme just kind of all come together. So Yorick represents legit physical decay. Hamlet kind of remembers who Yorick was and talks about that this is all that's left of him. I think he represents the loss of our identity, because at one point Hamlet is asking Yorick, where be your jibes now? Your songs, your gambles, like, where are your jokes? Where are your songs? Where are your pranks? They're all gone because you're gone, which is kind of a depressing idea that for a lot of us, for most of us probably, anything that we've done in life kind of dies with us. Very few people get to live forever in a legacy or in history. He represents the grim irony and joke of death. And this is really cool. So when Hamlet first starts talking about Yorick, he describes him as a man of infinite jest. But I think by the end of the monologue, we realize that the real infinite or eternal joke is that no matter who we are or what we achieve in life, this is the end that we all come to. We all end up worm food. We all end up dust. All we are is dust in the wind, to quote, is it Kansas? Did they sing that? I'm off topic. Anyway, and finally, Yorick as a symbol shows that death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter. Kings, Alexander the Great. Hamlet kind of goes on to talk about Alexander the Great becoming dust and being clay, and then ending up being a plug for a beer barrel. This great conqueror. Caesar, this great emperor of Rome, ending up being caulk in a window. That it reduces us all down to our most base elements. Okay, so all of that happens, and then Yorick is this symbol, and so maybe that explains why this is the most evocative image from the entire play. Something else I want to talk about here. Now, this is just me, but Shakespeare was a master with word choice. He chose words often that had double meanings. He chose words that kind of sounded like other words. For example, in Hamlet's first soliloquy, when he talks about his mother, he says, oh, what does he say? He says, yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes she married. Okay, galled eyes. Galled means red, you know? But he didn't say her red eyes, her crimson eyes, her amber eyes. He said galled. And galled sounds like gall, like, how dare you have the gall or the temerity to do something. Plus, it sounds grosser, he did that on purpose because he wanted to draw an equivalence between Gertrude's show of grief and her behavior after old Hamlet died. Okay, that's just one example. So coming back to this, because I have a point. The the clown, the gravedigger, says to Hamlet when he's talking about this skull, he says, "This same skull, sir, was Yorick's skull. This same skull, sir, was Yorick's skull." Yorick is an interesting name. It's 2 syllables, but it can very, very easily be truncated in speech into one. And to me, this same skull, sir, is your skull. And just follow me on this for a second. If there's a motif of death culminating in a theme here, the theme is that death comes to everyone. And when we think about this image of Hamlet holding the skull and why it's so evocative and why it's so powerful, then we have to think about the fact that at this moment in the play, even though Hamlet's been talking about death the entire play and kind of wanting to die the entire play, this is the moment where he is literally staring at and confronting his own mortality, in the sense that he is no longer looking at death as an escape or a release or sleep or dreams or anything philosophical or esoteric. He's looking at the physical reality that this is what we all end up being. And so for the gravedigger to hand over the skull and say, "This skull is Yorick's skull," I think we can very easily mutate that into, "This is you. This is what you become." And I think that helps Hamlet have kind of this resigned acceptance by the next scene that the only thing we can do in life is live so that we're ready for death when it comes. So, something to think about, right, guys? Okay. At this point, you can move on into the next activity. Bye.